Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating exploration of what makes us human using some very thought-provoking source material.
That's right. We're aiming to cover quite a bit.
Yeah, we'll be looking at, our deep biological origins, that key period often called the Great Leap Forward,
Mm-hmm.
right through to maybe some surprising reasons behind our social behaviors, like who we pick as partners, why conflict
And our
happens,
impact, of course.
and definitely our impact on the planet. Yeah, it's quite a scope.
And to really dig into this, we're drawing on evidence from all over the place. Archaeology, molecular biology.
Tiny details.
Yeah, exactly. Plus studies of living apes, humans, historical records, you name it. The idea is to pull out the big insights and sort of weave them together.
Connect the dots, yeah. And right away, a couple of major themes kind of jump out from the sources, don't they?
They really do.
First, and it can be a tough one, is our capacity for, well, destruction, whether that's towards each other or the environment.
A sobering reality, unfortunately.
And second, something I found really surprising, just how recently some defining human traits actually showed up.
Yeah, it wasn't all there from the start. Okay, so where do we begin? Our place in the bigger picture.
Let's start there. Where do we fit in the animal kingdom? The genetics are kind of startling.
They really are. When you look at us and chimpanzees, the genetic difference is tiny, about 1.6%.
Only 1.6%.
It's astonishing. Chimps are genuinely our closest living relatives, closer to us than they are to gorillas, even.
Wow.
And understanding that small gap, I mean, it really highlights how much environment and maybe even small genetic tweaks can shape behavior and capabilities.
It puts things in perspective. And the sources mentioned molecular biology helped pin down when we split from that common ancestor.
Yes, exactly. By looking at the rate genetic differences accumulate, calibrated against fossil dates, scientists estimate that divergence happened around 7 million years ago.
7 million.
And what's interesting is that the genetic distance between us and chimps is actually smaller than between some other pairs of species that look quite similar.
Which brings us to that idea that small genetic shifts can have massive behavioral consequences. The sexlet fish example was fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. In Lake Victoria, you had this explosion of diversity from likely a single ancestor, maybe 200,000 years ago.
In 200,000 years?
Relatively speaking, yes. It evolved into about 200 different cichlid species, and their diets are incredibly varied. Think tiger versus cow kind of differences.
Okay.
Yet, genetically, the DNA difference they studied averages only about 0.4%. It's a powerful illustration of how a little genetic change can lead to huge behavioral divergence.
Right. So, okay, for millions of years, our ancestors were, well, one source rather bluntly says, little more than glorified chimpanzees.
Yes, a bit harsh perhaps, but it makes the point about the pace of change.
And then, relatively suddenly, we get this great leap forward. What was that all about?
So this refers to a period starting maybe around 40,000 years ago where the archaeological record just lights up, especially in Europe with the arrival of Cro-Magnon's anatomically modern humans.
What kind of stuff starts appearing?
You see unequivocal art, musical instruments, much more sophisticated tools, bone needles, lamps, evidence of long-distance trade. Just a burst of innovation.
A real acceleration.
Exactly. And the thinking is this likely started earlier, perhaps in Africa or the Near East, and spread.
And this is a big shift from the millions of years before.
A massive shift. Before this, you had long periods of technological stability. Take the Neanderthals, who were in Europe before modern humans arrived.
Right. The Neanderthals, what was their story?
Well, they were around for a very long time, hundreds of thousands of years. And their stone tools, while effective for their needs, showed remarkably little change over that vast period.
But didn't they have slightly larger brains than us?
They did, yes.
Yeah.
On average, slightly larger brain capacity than modern Homo sapiens. Which is fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. Larger brain, but less innovation, it seems. What other differences did the sources point out between them and us?
Well, Neanderthal teeth show heavy wear patterns, suggesting they use their mouths almost like a third hand for gripping things while working.
Yeah.
Physically, they were much more robust, heavily muscled, thicker bones. Some evidence even suggests potentially longer gestation periods, longer pregnancies. And as mentioned, their toolkit was effective, but quite static compared to what came later.
But they weren't just, primitive brutes. The sources mention evidence of their humanity, too.
Absolutely crucial point. They definitely used fire routinely. There's evidence, though sometimes debated, for intentional burial of their dead.
That implies some level of symbolic thought, maybe?
Potentially. And very importantly, skeletal remains show individuals who survived serious injuries or lived to old age despite infirmities, which strongly suggests they cared for the sick and elderly within their groups. Compassion, social bonds.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to our social lives, our behaviors. The human life cycle is pretty unique, isn't it?
It really stands out, especially compared to other primates. The biggest thing is just how incredibly long our childhood dependency is.
We take ages to grow up.
Exactly. Human infants and children need a huge amount of parental investment, food, protection, learning, for far longer than any ape offspring.
And that has consequences for family structure.
Most likely, yes. This extended period of vulnerability probably necessitated stronger, more enduring bonds between parents. Both parents needed to contribute significantly, which isn't always the case in apes where the male role might be minimal post-conception.
Which leads to another really interesting point from the sources. Concealed ovulation in human females. And being receptive, well, pretty much all the time.
Yes, unlike most mammals where ovulation is clearly signaled and receptivity is limited to that fertile period.
What's the thinking on why that evolved?
The dominant theory is that it served primarily as a social bonding mechanism by making paternity less certain and sex less tied only to procreation.
It strengthens the pair bond.
Precisely. It encourages males to stick around, contribute to raising offspring, and maintain the relationship. Sex becomes partly about reinforcing those social ties, crucial for the co-parenting effort.
Makes sense. But then that brings us to the tricky subject of adultery. The sources mention this theory of extramarital sex, or EMS. What's the evolutionary angle there?
Well, from a purely sociobiological perspective, looking at gene transmission strategies, the costs and benefits can differ for males and females
How so?
due to the basic biological differences in reproduction. For males, theoretically, more partners could mean more offspring. For females, the investment in each pregnancy and child is immense, so partner quality and reliability might be more critical. And males face the risk of investing in offspring that aren't genetically theirs.
Paternity uncertainty.
Exactly, and you see echoes of this historically in many legal systems, where adultery laws were often much harsher on women, reflecting that concern over paternity.
So different strategies at a biological level. But the sources also warn against being too simplistic, right? It's not
Yeah.
just biology dictating behavior.
Oh, absolutely. That's a vital caveat. Evolutionary pressures might shape underlying tendencies, but human behavior is massively influenced by culture, individual choice, societal rules, emotions. It's far too complex to reduce just to maximizing gene copies.
Okay, now what about choosing partners? The idea of search images and marrying came up.
Right. We seem to develop these mental templates or search images for what we find attractive or suitable in a mate. This is shaped by experience, culture, family, lots of things.
And we tend to end up with people similar to us.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Studies show this strong tendency. It's called assortative mating. People pair up with partners who resemble them in all sorts of ways: age, ethnicity, religion, education, personality, political views.
Even physical traits. The sources mention some really specific ones.
Yeah, even things we might not consciously notice, like earlobe length or the distance between the eyes. It's quite remarkable. Part of it might just be that relationships function more smoothly with fewer points of friction if partners share similarities.
But not too similar. There was that principle of optimal intermediate similarity.
Ah, yes. That's observed in animal studies: quail, mice, rats. They seem to prefer mates who are somewhat similar to their parents or siblings, maybe indicating genetic compatibility but not too closely related, which avoids the risks of inbreeding.
A kind of Goldilocks zone for relatedness.
Kind of, yeah. Familiar enough, but different enough. A balance.
Okay, this connects nicely to the origins of what we call race and different beauty standards. The sources suggest sexual selection plays a big role here.
Yes, Darwin himself proposed this. He argued that many visible physical differences between human groups, things we often label as racial characteristics, might be driven more by mate preferences, by sexual selection, than by a natural selection for survival.
More than just, say, skin color adapting to sunlight.
Well, natural selection is definitely part of the story for skin color and UV protection. But the sources point out the correlation isn't perfect globally. There are inconsistencies that pure natural selection doesn't easily explain.
So maybe our ancestors just found certain traits attractive in certain places.
That's the idea. Similar to how female birds might prefer males with brighter feathers or more elaborate songs, even if those traits don't directly help survival. Think of bowerbirds building incredibly decorated structures just to attract mates.
Or the different color phases in snow geese mentioned in the sources.
Exactly, those seem driven by mate choice. And if people tend to marry people who look like them, as we just discussed with assortative mating, that would reinforce local physical traits and beauty standards over generations.
Fascinating. Okay, let's switch tracks again. Aging and language. Big topics.
Yeah.
What's the evolutionary take on why we get old?
From an evolutionary perspective, aging is kind of a trade-off. How much energy does an organism invest in maintaining and repairing its body versus reproducing?
A biological budget.
Sort of. If a species faces high risks of dying from accidents or predation early on, there might be less evolutionary pressure to invest heavily in long-term maintenance past peak reproductive age. If you're likely to be eaten by a lion tomorrow, why invest in fixing cellular damage that only causes problems decades later?
But humans live quite long past reproductive age, especially females with menopause. How does that fit?
That's where the long childhood dependency comes back in. The grandmother hypothesis, for example, suggests that older women, even after they stopped reproducing themselves, could significantly boost the survival chances of their children and grandchildren by providing care, resources, and crucial knowledge.
So grandparents as repositories of wisdom and extra help.
Exactly. In pre-literate societies especially, older individuals held vital information about resources, social rules, history. Their survival benefited the whole group.
Makes sense. Now, language. That feels so fundamentally human, but tracing its origins seems really hard.
It's incredibly difficult because spoken language doesn't fossilize. We can look at changes in brain structure from skulls or the anatomy of the vocal tract, but it's indirect.
How does our language compare to animal communication? The vervet monkeys came up.
Right. Vervet monkeys have specific alarm calls for different predators: eagle, leopard, snake. That shows symbolic representation. But human language has grammar, syntax, the ability to combine elements endlessly to create new meanings.
And lots of words that don't directly refer to things, like the is if.
Precisely those grammatical function words. That complexity seems unique. The sources also mention studying Pidgin and Creole languages.
How does that help?
Because these languages often develop rapidly when people with no common language need to communicate. Seeing how basic communication systems quickly gain grammatical structure, often influenced by children learning them, might give clues about our innate human capacity for language.
Interesting. Okay, let's tackle art and our weird tendency to use toxic chemicals. What's the evolutionary thinking there?
Well, the first clear, undeniable art appears relatively late in the archaeological record, around that great leap forward time with the Cro-Magnons.
Cave paintings, figurines.
Yes. And the traditional view is often that art is purely aesthetic, non-functional, but the sources challenge that.
How? By comparing it to animals again?
Yeah, like those bowerbirds. Their elaborate constructions aren't just pretty. They directly signal the male's quality to potential mates. It serves a clear reproductive function.
So early human art might have also been about signaling.
Very likely. Signaling status, skills, resource control, maybe group identity, reinforcing social bonds, and it probably wasn't just for decoration.
Okay, but using toxins, that seems counterintuitive for survival. Kerosene drinking.
The handicap principle comes up again here. The idea is that engaging in a costly or risky behavior and surviving it can be an honest signal of underlying quality strength, resilience, good genes.
Like saying, look how tough I am, I can even handle this poison.
Essentially, yes. The source mentions Artie, a man in New Guinea, doing exactly that with kerosene as a display. And there are historical examples of ritualistic use of intoxicants, like those intoxicating enemas in some indigenous cultures.
Wow.
But the crucial difference is that while animals might engage in risky signaling, human use of toxic substances often gets tangled up with addiction, leading to self-destruction in a way that's perhaps less common in those animal examples.
Right, it goes beyond signaling. Okay, switching scale completely now. The Fermi paradox. Where are all the aliens?
The big question. The paradox is simply, the universe seems vast and old, the ingredients for life seem common, so statistically intelligent life should be out there. Yet we see zero evidence of it.
So what do sources suggest? Maybe intelligent technological life is just rare.
That's one strong possibility raised. Maybe the evolutionary path from simple life to a species capable of building radio telescopes and spaceships is incredibly improbable, with many difficult hurdles. Maybe we are the anomaly.
A humbling thought. And this connects to the idea of first contact. The sources used a real-world example from New Guinea.
Yes, the Archibald expedition in 1938 stumbling upon the Grand Valley of the Balaam River. They found a large, previously unknown agricultural society, completely isolated,
What was the impact?
profound and rapid. The encounter transformed their material culture, social practices, their whole worldview almost overnight. It shows just how disruptive and transformative first contact can be, whether it's terrestrial or potentially extraterrestrial.
Which leads us back down to Earth and another major transformation, the agricultural revolution. Often seen as purely positive, but maybe not.
Definitely a more mixed bag than the simple progress narrative suggests. While agriculture eventually supported larger populations, the early stages often brought significant downsides.
Like what?
Poor nutrition, for one. Early farmers often relied heavily on one or two staple crops like corn, which could lead to deficiencies compared to the varied diet of hunter-gatherers.
And the sources mention health declining.
Yes, paleopathology, studying disease in ancient skeletons, shows this clearly in some areas. For instance, American Indian skeletons from the Illinois and Ohio river valleys show increases in signs of malnutrition, infectious disease, and shorter stature after the adoption of corn agriculture.
So people weren't necessarily jumping at the chance to become farmers.
Apparently not always. The spread of agriculture across Europe was surprisingly slow, and some hunter-gatherer groups actively resisted it for a long time, suggesting they didn't see it as an obvious upgrade to their way of life. Plus, it led to more sedentary living, denser populations, easier spread of disease, and often more rigid social hierarchies.
Right, and this idea that early humans lived in perfect harmony with nature, also not quite right.
Yeah, that's largely a myth, a sort of Rousseau-esque fantasy, as one source puts it. The evidence for pre-industrial environmental damage is substantial.
Such as?
Well, major extinction events often followed human arrival in new lands. The giant moa birds in New Zealand wiped out by the Maori settlers. Numerous bird species on Pacific islands disappearing after Polynesian colonization.
So overhunting was a pattern.
A recurring pattern. But also habitat destruction. The collapse of the Anasazi civilization in Chaco Canyon is linked to deforestation and resource depletion. Think about the environmental degradation around the Mediterranean deforestation in ancient Greece, Rome, the Middle East. That has a long history.
But weren't some societies sustainable?
Yes, particularly smaller-scale societies living in the same place for a very long time, they often developed sustainable practices. But the risk of damage seems highest during colonization of new areas, expansion along frontiers, or when powerful new technologies are adopted without understanding the long-term consequences.
Which brings us, sadly, to our capacity for conflict, specifically genocide, another thing that's not just modern.
Tragically, no. Xenophobic mass murder has a long, dark history. The sources give stark examples like the deliberate extermination of the Tasmanians by European settlers, or the catastrophic decline of Aboriginal Australians following colonization.
It's hard to even comprehend.
It is. And defining genocide can be complex, but the pattern of targeting specific groups for elimination is recurrent. Disturbingly, observations of wild chimpanzees have documented instances of what looks like planned, coordinated, lethal attacks between neighboring groups, raiding parties, territorial warfare.
Chimps, too. That suggests really deep evolutionary roots for this kind of behavior.
It certainly points towards the potential for intense, lethal intergroup aggression being part of our primate heritage, not just a product of recent civilization.
And the justifications people use.
Often involve dehumanizing the victims, blaming them for their own fate, rewriting history, psychological mechanisms to enable horrific acts, and the impact on survivors is devastating, often including things like psychological numbing just to cope.
So looking at this whole sweep of history and behavior, what's the big picture takeaway about us and our future?
The sources paint a picture of humans as a highly successful, adaptable species, but one with a recurring pattern of acting like a switching predator. Meaning, we arrive in a new environment or develop a new technology, exploit resources very effectively, often to the point of depletion or causing extinctions, and then maybe move on or switch to a different resource. We see this pattern throughout history and prehistory.
And there are parallels in nature, animals overshooting their resources.
Yes, examples exist of animal populations booming, exhausting their food supply, and then crashing, sometimes driving themselves to local extinction. It's a sobering reminder of ecological limits.
So our current environmental crisis
Is, in many ways, the same pattern playing out on a global scale, fueled by powerful technologies and a massive population. The environmental holocaust, as one source starkly calls it, is already well underway. Urgent countermeasures are obviously needed.
Is there any optimism in the sources?
A cautious note, yes. They do point to examples where conservation efforts have worked, where environmental awareness has led to positive changes in policy and behavior. So it highlights the potential for change through citizen action, better governance, and perhaps learning from our past mistakes.
It's certainly sobering to see how deep these patterns run. The challenges we face now aren't entirely brand new, are they?
Not entirely, no. This deep dive really underscores that long history, the complexity. There's this constant tension, isn't there, between our incredible ingenuity, our capacity for progress, and cooperation.
And these deeply ingrained tendencies towards conflict, destruction, and environmental overshoot.
Exactly. And the sources suggest that really understanding this long evolutionary story, our ecological track record, is maybe the most crucial tool we have for trying to navigate the future more wisely. For you, the listener, grappling with this history is key.
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it's offered some new perspectives on, well, us and the long, complex journey that got us here.